Welcome. Getting close to the end of the term. I hope you still have energy left. I see some exhaustion around the campus these days, but I sympathize. Almost there. So before we start off today, let me acknowledge and respect the Kwang peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees clan of the Sonic people, whose historical relationship with this land continues to this day. And with this acknowledgement, I have the pleasure of introducing Jennifer Waldman. I think all of you will have met Jennifer and Jenny in the hallways, but let me give you a sense of where Jennifer Waldman is from the University of Alberta. We just talked about this. That's her normally post in the Department of Philosophy, but it's a great pleasure having her at the moment as a visiting fellow at CFGS. As you can see here, she teaches in the broader fields of ethics and history of moral philosophy and environmental ethics, and I think that gives you a sense of how she frames and positions her paper today. As you can see here, in terms of her intellectual background and influence, you see American pragmatist, Dewey. That was the focus of your PhD, and then you can see. Do you call this modern contemporary philosophy? 19th, 20th century American philosophy in particular. You can see here a wide range of philosophers to draw on when it comes to issues of ethics. And you can see also that Jennifer is founding director of the Canadian Society for Environmental Philosophy. So the idea of bringing together classical field of philosophy with environmental issues, studies, and I think in this spirit we will hear today your presentation on the oceans. And could you go back the title? I wasn't able to memorize that one. Here, desiring to act as stewards of the ocean, intergenerational equity, a new high seas treaty. Very timely. Those of you following the news will have heard about also some progress in this respect. So, Jennifer, great pleasure having you in the center, and the floor is all yours. And hello also to you online. Okay, wonderful.
Well, greetings from Treaty 6 territory, where I come from. I'm very glad to be received here from the University of Alberta in the city of Amiskwasi, Wakanikan, now known as Edmonton. Very glad to be welcomed here. So, the title comes from the new, called variously the High Seas Treaty or the BBNJ. I think the media are right to call it High Seas Treaty, because then you don't have to explain what the acronym means. When Rita Lee, Singapore's ambassador for oceans, concluded her announcement of the successful negotiation of the new UN Convention on Protection of Marine Biodiversity, with heartfelt words, "The ship has reached the shore," many Canadians may have been bemused, because only less, in fact, than a month before, Stephen Guilbeault, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, had announced the government's intention to establish 10 new marine conservation areas as part of the government's strategy of conserving 25% of Canada's oceans by 2025 and 30% by 2030. According to the United Nations Environment Program, there are already 18,426 marine areas receiving some globally. The total area covered is still a little bit short of UN Sustainability Development Goals of 10% of the world's ocean protected by 2020. And if the goal of 30% called for by the new global biodiversity framework adopted last year in Montreal is to be met by that date, coastal nations like Canada will have to pick up the pace of their marine protection. But given the progress already made under the existing 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, why was a new treaty necessary? What new issues might it create? And why on earth did Rita Lee celebrate the treaty's conclusion by quoting REO Speedwagon's 1984 hit song, "Can't Fight This Feeling"? I'll have to leave it to others to answer the last question. I really have no idea why the song spoke to the ambassador so viscerally. She referenced it many times, apparently during the negotiations. Instead, I'll present a case to illustrate the previously intractable obstacles to marine conservation of the framers of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Henceforth, I've tried to minimize acronyms, but I'm going to have to use this one, UNCLOS, inadvertently created. And I'll then go on to discuss the creative solution adopted in the new High Seas Treaty through its invocation of environmental stewardship and intergenerational equity. And I'll conclude with a discussion of some kinds of questions the new treaty raises, in particular, what might intergenerational equity and justice regarding biodiversity in the high seas entail. So, let's advance. I can't be able to advance. It's not. Okay, the Sargasso Sea is an approximately 5 million square mile area of the North Atlantic. It's named for the unusually dense growth of a form of macroalgae called sargassum on and beneath its surface. The only sea without a coastline, the Sargasso is bounded instead by the clockwise flow of 4 ocean currents, and these currents form a gyre which keeps the sargassum growing there from drifting away, encouraging the formation of the extensive mats that are distinctive to this region's ecosystem. So the sargassum that you've been hearing about that's washing up in Florida and the Caribbean and parts of African shores as well, is not coming from the Sargasso Sea, although a lot of newspapers claim that. It's actually coming from what's called a sargassum belt that runs about along where you see that red arrow that's marking the North Equatorial Current. And sargassum forms lots of places. It just doesn't normally form large extensive mats. And what's distinctive about the Sargasso Sea is those mats don't leave, they stay there permanently. So you have massive, massive regions, mats, characterizing and shaping this ecosystem. Okay, so this makes it ecologically significant in diverse ways. First, the sargassum weed mats support a number of endemic species, such as this charming little creature, the sargassum frogfish, whose fins are adapted so that you crawl through the weed. Very cool. Looks like it's evolving towards becoming the creature from the golden brown lagoon in the future. Second, and more significantly from a global perspective, the Sargasso Sea supports many endangered species of birds, fish, and marine mammals, albeit in ways not yet fully understood. It's a spawning ground for commercially valuable species of fish, such as albacore tuna, swordfish, wahoo, dolphin fish, freshwater eels from both Europe and North America, and blue and white marlin. The mats also act as nurseries for these and other species, including endangered loggerhead, hawksbill, green, and Kemp's Ridley's sea turtles. Several shark species appear to pup there, including porbeagle sharks, whose Northeast Atlantic populations are critically endangered. 24 species of birds make regular use of the biotic richness of the Sargasso Sea, as well as 30 species of whales, dolphin, and other migratory species who use the area to fuel their peregrinations. It's likely that deep water corals are also supported by biotic material deposited by sargassum-based communities on the deep ocean floors. It's certain that the sargassum mats, when they die and fall, sequester significant amounts of carbon, making the region an important carbon sink. As this slide from a recent study indicates, it's comparing the efficacy of sargassum as a form of carbon management with both subsurface carbon dioxide injection, we do some of that in Alberta, and ocean fertilization, a really scary process, which there are some more experiments going on with. And there's been discussion of whether you deliberately farm sargassum to increase deposition of carbon. Now, thanks to the efforts of an international consortium, the Sargasso Sea Commission, the Sargasso Sea has been declared an ecologically or biologically significant area, EBSA, by the parties to the UN Convention on Biodiversity. That happened in 2012. This designation provides no legal protection, however, because of the region's position in the area of the high seas. So, under UNCLOS, ocean territories and the responsibility for the management of their resources are divided as this slide indicates. Starting on the left, you can see coastal nations have sovereignty over their territorial waters. They extend just 12 miles beyond their shorelines. They also have sovereign rights over the marine and seabed resources of an exclusive economic zone, EEZ, which extends 200 miles beyond their shores. Typically, that will include the whole of a continental shelf or in the case of archipelagos such as Japan and the Philippines, for example, all the region within their outermost islands. The area of the high seas begins roughly about that point, although states may retain some exclusive rights to exploration of the seabed along the downward slope of the continental shelf, leading towards the deep ocean floor, or up to a further 350 miles potentially. Okay. The high seas area lies beyond that, and by contrast, it's a global commons. So if you look at the light areas on this map, that's the region of the high seas. Much more extensive than the continental areas, which is where pretty much all marine protected areas currently are located. Okay, nations are free to use this area as they see fit, consistent with two broad commitments. The first is recognition of the freedom of the high seas, more specifically three freedoms: freedom of transit, fishing, and marine research. Second is recognition that the sea floor and its mineral resources are the quote-unquote common heritage of mankind. The two together are meant to ensure equity between coastal and landlocked nations on one hand, and developed and developing nations on the other. No state may bar the passage of other nations' fleets, including their fishing fleets, or bar other states from engaging in scientific research upon, or provided they provide appropriate notification and to get some review, mining deep ocean resources. On the contrary, coastal and developed nations are encouraged to share information and technology with landlocked and developing nations to ensure their equitable access to the economic opportunities the high seas afford. Now, not long after UNCLOS was adopted, it became apparent the framers had been short-sighted in two key respects. The first was that the framers' conception of equity was narrowly geographical. All nations were to have the opportunity to share in the common heritage of the high seas, quote, irrespective of the geographical location of states, whether coastal or landlocked, and taking into particular consideration the interests and needs of developing states and of peoples who have not attained full independence or other self-governing status recognized by the UN. Now, on this understanding of equity, provided no nation was barred from participation in, say, the collapse of a high seas fishery, or the depletion of non-renewable resources of the ocean floor, exploiting the marine environment in these ways would not necessarily be objectionable under UNCLOS. Were any state to take action to prevent such outcomes, for example, the territory of Bermuda, whose tiny little EEZ falls within the Sargasso Sea, that state could find itself brought up on charges before the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. This is not to say states have no conservation obligations under UNCLOS. Coastal nations have the duty to take action to conserve marine species within their territorial areas and their EEZs. They also have a duty to cooperate with other states in the conservation and management of the living resources in the areas of the high seas. But UNCLOS provided no enforceable mechanisms for protecting vulnerable stocks in the area. In 1994, a further convention under UNCLOS was adopted that enjoined states to create regional fisheries management organizations to establish catch limits for particular species that spend most of their time in the high seas, and allows them to ban fishing by fleets from nations which do not agree to the catch limits. Now, where does this leave the Sargasso Sea? Not much better off. There are currently 17 RMFOs globally, although only some of them have full authority to enforce conservation recommendations. 2 have authority over some or all of the Sargasso Sea: the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization, NAFO, slide on the left, and the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, ICAT, right. To date, ICAT has not agreed to impose any special restrictions on the fishing of tuna and related species in this region, and their general management of tuna has been terrible. NAFO has agreed that a series of underwater seamounts is ecologically important habitat for the fish stocks it manages. And so it's closed the seamounts within its jurisdiction to trawling and other deep water fishing techniques that would harm the community of life that lie on these surfaces. But if you see where the red line is, that indicates the southernmost boundary of NAFO's jurisdiction. So this leaves the bulk of the Sargasso Sea, even taking into account Bermuda's EEZ, wholly unprotected, and some of the most probably important ecological regions. The second problem that UNCLOS's framers' short-sightedness created has to do with its description of the common heritage, of what the description of the common heritage of mankind is supposed to include. According to Article 13, the area to which the common heritage principle applies, resources means, quote, all solid, liquid, or gaseous mineral resources in situ in the area at or beneath the seabed, including polymetallic nodules, end quote, which it collectively refers to as minerals. It assigns the equitable management of development opportunities of these minerals to a new agency, new at the time, the International Seabed Authority, which is based in Jamaica. The framers did not anticipate the revolution in biotechnology that was about to take place. Marine genetic materials in the whole of the water column above the seabed are resources for which states are now keen to compete. Many have wanted to compete free of any restrictions to practice conservation or to share the results of their bioprospecting. So they've objected to suggestions that marine genetic resources should be considered part of the common heritage of mankind or subject to management by the International Seabed Authority. So, second serious problem here. So the ship, which Rena Lee helped steer to shore, is a new international treaty intended to correct these two oversights by providing a legally binding means of protecting ecologically significant marine areas and ensuring equitable development of marine genetic resources consistent with the overall structure of UNCLOS. And one running topic of dispute was by which of UNCLOS's two main principles, the living contents of the high seas water column, other than commercial fish stocks, should be governed, either high seas freedom or the common heritage principle. Understandably, nations already equipped to commercialize successful results of genetic research resisted application of the common heritage principle, as this would require their developments to contribute to quote unquote the benefit of mankind as a whole, and not merely their own private industries. For similar reasons, they were disinclined to approve of protected zones in the high seas if these would be off limits to shipping, fishing, and or scientific research. So they argued the high seas principle should govern. Pacific, small island states, and developing nations, especially coastal ones, argued instead that common heritage principle should govern. Being heavily reliant on small-scale artisanal fisheries for food security, it was in these states' interest to limit high seas freedoms to protect marine habitat supporting those fisheries. And of course, they did not want their relative lack of capacity to immediately begin conducting genetic research to bar them from benefiting from successful bioprospecting by larger, more economically powerful states and their corporations. With neither side willing to allow the other's preferred principle to take precedence, the obvious pragmatic solution was to import a principle from some other widely accepted UN conventions that could help provide a framework for balancing the competing UNCLOS principles in particular cases. As it was Pacific, small island, and developing coastal states that had the greatest interest in seeing that high seas freedoms should not prevail, their ambassadors argued repeatedly and ultimately successfully for adoption of principles of intergenerational equity and recognition of states as stewards of the ocean environment. Where this appeared in the treaty varied from version to version, starting with what were called the PrepCon meetings. Eventually, some of this language, which was one time actually a principle, ended up in the preamble, but it survived. Interestingly, although the whole point of the endeavor was to create an enforceable treaty, if you look at the title, on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction, early draft language didn't define sustainability. As well as preferring high seas freedoms to take precedence in the new treaty, some states clearly also preferred equity to continue to be understood in purely geographical terms, with no requirements to consider the interests of future generations. Presumably, they would also be resistant to incorporation of a commitment to stewardship, as to be a steward is to be a trustee or fiduciary charged with the care of things or persons in the interests of others, such as future generations. Early drafts didn't specify to whom the duty of stewardship was owed. But eventually, the parties came to see the value of invoking a duty to future generations as providing a principal basis for limiting high seas freedoms. This is at any rate how the parties characterized their approach in the preamble. So the text preserves earlier unclosed commitments to equity as a governing principle, but it asks the following text. In the preamble, desiring to act as stewards of the ocean in areas beyond national distinction on behalf of present and future generations by protecting and caring for and ensuring responsible use of the marine environment, maintaining the integrity of ocean ecosystems, and conserving the inherent value of biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. Similarly, in the statement of the agreement's overall objective, they added this language: to ensure the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction for the present and in the long term, and sustainability is defined accordingly as referring to use that does not lead to a long-term decline of biological diversity, thereby maintaining its potential to meet the needs and aspirations of present and future generations. And it took years to achieve this. But bingo, we have a principal basis for creating marine protected areas, as well as limitations on high seas freedoms, and further provides those piggybacking on these, provide a basis for sharing marine genetic research. But I'm going to leave that aside for now. I'm just going to focus on marine protected areas. So what does it mean for ethical conduct towards the oceans? Some specialists in environmental ethics will be disappointed by the text of the High Seas Treaty. While it describes biodiversity at one point as possessing inherent value, this is not the basis on which marine protected areas are justified, but rather elsewhere that they, quote, support food security and other socioeconomic objectives, including protection of cultural values, end quote. Many environmentalists will want to reject the instrumentalizing approach to nature the treaty adopts, but pragmatists like myself will welcome the opportunity to make use of these new conservation opportunities. So instead of bemoaning what might otherwise have been, if, for example, negotiators had instead decided to treat oceans as persons in their own right, as sometimes proposed for rivers, pragmatists will focus on how best to make use of this new regime of ocean stewardship and equity to work to the benefit of future generations of human and non-human life. And one important challenge will be to develop a consensus on what intergenerational equity is going to mean in this context. So pardon my verging into philosophy a little bit. And theories of distributive justice. So this is a couple of broad categories that are often used to distinguish broad families of theories. For some theorists of distributive justice and equity, who are collectively lumped under the term cosmopolitan, the context shouldn't matter. They think that we think rightly, should intuit that duties of distributive justice and equity just obviously apply to around the globe. It isn't just that we have duties of charity to people in other nations if they're in financial trouble or experiencing disasters or have suffered from the legacy of colonialism. They think duties of justice apply. So if duties of justice apply universally, there has to be a single universal principle which captures what's underlying that intuition. Now, if they then argue about what that principle should it be some kind of egalitarianism? We should all be equal in terms of our opportunities, welfare, whatever it is, or sufficientarian, which means everybody should have enough, that equality doesn't matter provided everybody has enough, or there are prioritarians who say you always start with whoever's first off. Under the equally broad heading of communitarianism are all those folks who say, no, we don't share that intuition. We think schemes of distributive justice and equity are schemes where we decide what we owe one another within a society. In other nations, but they're duties of charity. When they have to do with welfare, they're not duties of distributive justice. There might be duties of corrective justice in the case of colonialism, But that has to do with wrongs that need to be rectified, not sort of how well people are faring, how happy they are, and so forth. And they feel that alien conceptions of justice should not be, imposed from the outside. Well, in between these polar opposites or versions of what Jonathan Wolff calls a layers of justice view, and I'm calling this adapted from him because I'm not sure you well can quote exactly what I've done with it. Okay, on Wolff's approach, what counts as just and equitable in any given context is, quote, relative to the norms of cooperation, and the norms of cooperation differ in the context of domestic and global cooperation. So against the communitarians, he says, look, the European Union is not a single society with a single set of values, but member states can, within their scheme of agreements, act justly or unjustly towards one another, given the terms of their union. Similarly, we may reasonably argue that while parties to the High Seas Treaty are not members of a single monolithic community sharing one set of values, norms of cooperation operating over the formation of the treaty can nevertheless create a standard for what is or is not going to be just or equitable conduct of one member towards others regarding the activities it covers. UN agreements are, by and large, generally relatively egalitarian in their requirements of the recognition of rights, human rights, including rights of indigenous peoples now, and of states to determine for themselves what principles of distributive justice and equity will hold internally. Regarding the welfare conditions of states as a whole, these agreements lean towards sufficientarianism, not egalitarianism. The sufficientarian intuition being that what matters, again, is not that everyone has equal capacities for welfare and happiness, but that everyone has sufficient for them to escape lives of duress. This is the sort of approach we see in many UN conventions. They don't propose that states should benefit equally from their agreements. Instead, they call for special consideration for states whose economic development is less than sufficient to assure their citizens can develop all the central capabilities of human life required, for lives free of duress. Now, they're doing so as not an expression of benevolence, or at least not that alone. It's a matter of justice, and of the kind of justice that they're working within. States whose economic circumstances undermine current and future generations' capacities to uphold their agreements over time cannot be held responsible if they renege on their international agreements. So for these agreements to work, states have to be functional intergenerational agencies. That means their populaces cannot be collapsing. So that would undermine the legitimacy of any treaty over time. So it's a norm of the conditions of successful negotiation of these treaties that a sort of sufficientarian norm of distributive justice and equity has to some extent, be accepted by all parties. Now, some may worry this approach lets the parties off too lightly. I don't think this is necessarily the case. And to illustrate, let's return to the case of the Sargasso Sea to see what a layers of justice view might imply here. Now, only states or authorities recognized by the UN can propose that an area like the Sargasso Sea become a marine protected area. So the Sargasso Sea Commission lacks the relevant status. It can't put in the proposal, nor can many of the current signatories to the agreement that set this up, because many of them are territories or protectorates of other nations or non-governmental organizations or so forth. So who is left who's able to make such a proposal? Monaco, the UK, the US, the Bahamas, Canada, and the Dominican Republic. Neither the Dominican Republic or the Bahamas are terribly well suited to bear the first part of the conservation burden, as it's called, of putting in a proposal. You have to put in the proposal, you have to have done thorough extensive research, you have to come up with a management plan for the area that has to be researched. You have to do consultations with adjacent states. It's a long process. It involves a lot of work. And by comparison with Bahamas and Republic, several of these other nations, the UK, the US, Canada, certainly. You would think that the duty of justice falls more heavily on these nations. At the global level, certainly Canada's much greater capacity to absorb these upfront conservation burdens suggests Canada has a weightier duty than many others to ensure future generations are not irreparably harmed by continued damage to this ecosystem by overfishing, plastic pollution, intense marine traffic, and potential mining. There are a couple of seabed authority gave a couple of exploratory permissions to mine in this region, though we haven't given permission to develop them yet. Now, given the global significance of the region, I think that reason is actually weighty enough that the Canadian government should feel obliged to lead a campaign to get it officially designated as a protected area as soon as that becomes possible, which will be a matter of who knows how many years. 60 nations have to agree to the new marine treaty before it becomes operational. But Canada has yet other reasons why I think Canada should really step up here. I mean, it has all the same reasons of justice and equity other nations do, particularly those adjacent to the area. But Canada has particularly weighty internal reasons of justice and equity to protect some of the species there, in particular eels, and to do so in a way that doesn't impose avoidable conservation burdens on its own Indigenous communities, and so better contribute to reconciliation with them. So, as some of you may know, all North American and European eels go to the Sargasso Sea to spawn. Nobody knows exactly where they do it there, but somewhere they do it because then larvae turn up and they drift out of the region. North American ones drift out somehow to estuaries where they then become these little eels you see on the right. By that point, they're elvers or glass eels because they're transparent. They go upriver or wherever and settle down for some period of years. Then eventually, they get the call and off they go. So I haven't bothered to show the migration routes of the European ones, but it's the same region. Now, a little over 10 years ago, it seemed like a good idea at the time because European eels numbers are just crashing. So they got listed as an endangered species. This triggered enormous amounts of smuggling going on in Europe, and a huge industry has developed. This is because there's also a huge demand for eels in a number of Asian nations whose populations of eels have also crashed. But they've developed ways of doing aquaculture with these eels. Nobody can get eels to spawn anywhere, so you can't do aquaculture with adult eels. But what you can do is get a whole mass of these little glass eels from somewhere, put them in tanks, then treat them to feminize them because female eels grow bigger. So if you pack them too closely, they'll all be male. So you have to also give them hormones. In fact, then you've got lots of eels. In some ways, it could be sort of advantageous to fishing them all. But when the population is crashing and you've got a lot of people going after these glass eels because there's now this huge market for them. This is now eels, these little glass eels, the most expensive fish per pound you can buy anywhere in the world because of these markets. So initially, there wasn't, American eels, North American eels, I should say, although they're called American eels. There wasn't a commercial market for this that was very extensive. Many people in North America, US and Canada, don't eat eels much at all, including Indigenous people did not fish for glass eels. Some Europeans did eat them, but even Europeans didn't eat large ones. But once this market opens up, because there are huge aquaculture facilities developing in Asia, well, now there's a market for them. Yeah, currently, this is North American ones. Most latest price, $2,154 US, not $80 per pound. So they're very expensive. So naturally, Indigenous communities have seen this as an opportunity to develop moderate livelihood fisheries and to compete for those where they existed. So in the whole of the sort of Bay of Fundy region, there are, I think, only 9 in Canada fishing licenses. Only one of these was to an Indigenous community. They began to see Indigenous communities either trying to set up their own fisheries or individuals fishing and getting arrested. Since, as I said, since CITES brought that in, the market has just taken off in North America. Now there's a demand for these things. And this has the appalling effect now, increasingly, of pitting Indigenous communities against one another. So Indigenous communities on the coastline are the ones who can benefit from glassing fishery. Indigenous communities who live further inland, who actually have historically relied on eels for not so much to sell as food and for cultural reasons, are now getting really worried. Their eel populations are already facing a lot of challenges, and here's yet another one. So because Canada has duties of justice and equity that are far more extensive than just the fishing community, I think Canada has a reason to really step up and take the burden off these Indigenous communities and Indigenous fishers, not put them in a position where they're under such stress they might be in competition with one another. They have taken some steps. They've reallocated some of the fishing catch currently to Indigenous fisheries, but this is small scale stuff. There's a lot of other stuff that should be happening, of course. River pollution, particularly from agricultural runoff, is a huge challenge for eels as for other fish. So much more work should be done about that. Blocked culverts, which are a problem for salmon and shad and some other fishes, are also a challenge for eel. This has been blocked by beavers, who are nice in their own way, but you still need to be regularly clearing these things out. We have very few eel ladders in Canada at dams. Eels can't get over dams, and turbines kill dams when they go through hydroelectric dam turbines. But you can quite easily construct with these really cool eel ladders. You run some water down, they're attracted by the splashing at the bottom, and they can just wiggle their way up through these tubes. Now, if it's a bigger dam, you need a bigger ladder. But there are places that sell these things. It's not like you couldn't do it, but we still have very few in Canada. So there's a lot of stuff like this that should be done. But Canada is really well positioned to do something more, and that is protect the eel spawning grounds. We don't know exactly where it is, so I put this proposed protected area a little low because there's some thinking that it is probably at a convergence zone between currents that's roughly around there. That's also where some other species, particularly of sharks, are maybe going to pup. A little unclear, but that could certainly help. If you could protect it, you could diminish some of the shipping transit through there, get the IMO to move some of the shipping routes, which they break up algae mats, so it's probably not good for this region. And Canada is well placed to do so. We have the resources, we have the connections, we have particular interests. And I'm told by the Sargasso Sea Commission director that the DFO has actually been very actively interested and concerned with international workshops and so forth on protection of eels and their relation to the Sargasso Sea. So, June 8th is World Oceans Day. If you're a Canadian, I suggest you celebrate it by writing a letter to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change or to Canada's DFO, supporting a Canadian push for a marine protected area in the region of the Sargasso Sea when that becomes possible to do. If you're not a Canadian citizen, write to your own equivalents. No matter where you are, you may be benefiting from the Sargasso Sea. So that's my presentation. Found it interesting.
For insight into naturally asking, what I do start it all questions. always been fascinated by eels. They make their way from Europe all across just for fun, and you think these little creatures, they go on the land, it's a degree of, they're determined to make it, and, you're right, I read they haven't figured out where they, it's a sort of fascinating creature.
Yeah.
I don't know how bad state they're in, actually.
Yeah.
So I've got one feasibility question and one justification question. Let's start with the second one. You talked about intergenerational justice arguments, right? But then it seemed to me that what you gave us at the end were actually almost intra-generational justice arguments, or if they were intergenerational, they were to some extent backward-looking. Implicitly suggesting that Canada has particular duties in part because of duties that we have towards Indigenous populations, right? So is that part of the story? How do we? What exactly are the duties that your case for Canada is based on? So I wasn't quite sure what that ended up being. Maybe I missed it, but
yeah.
maybe you want to do that first, and then I'll ask the feasibility question after.
Well, I'd say there are layers of reasons of justice. So one of the reasons for looking at Canada in particular was to try to assuage concerns which maybe nobody sitting here had, but which other people I will talk to later on about this will, that if you only use a sort of sufficientarian account of distributive justice at the global level, that's just too weak and it won't have any real bite. And there are concerns. We've had this sort of approach to agreements about climate change and what Millennium Development Goals, Sustainability Development Goals we've got currently. And the larger, more economically powerful nations have put some money into green funds and other international funds to help support adaptation and mitigation in less well-off countries. But none of them have met their actual stated early on pledges. So it's sort of a weak regime, and I agree with that, and that's a real concern. But that's, so I accept that, but I also think that we can run other kinds of arguments pitched at particular countries like Canada in this case. Okay, you have this general duty as an economic powerful country. Here's some more reasons why. There are different reasons of justice. They're owed to different future generations and present generations. But we can pile on, in other words, literally pile on. So the second part of the pile on, the ones that are more domestic, I'm thinking not so much of the past of colonialism, but simply current undertakings of the governments that we've had in the time that I've lived in Canada, which say that we're supposed to be doing reconciliation and improving the condition of lives. A recent court case that established the right to moderate livelihood fisheries, which interesting was a case based on a prosecution of a man for eel fishing, although he wasn't fishing for glass eels, I believe. And you can make a similar, it wouldn't only be Canada, actually, you can make similar arguments in the US, where there are also court cases where charges have been brought against indigenous fishers who are trying to tap into the same market. And not only in them, there's also now, there was a big smuggling bust off Long Island, somewhere they were shipping glass eels out, they got there. So we've got current understandings and expectations of what rights of present generations of Canadians are, includes indigenous ones. They're being very poorly met, and concerns about these communities' future survival, and the concerns about future generations of Canadians, as well as people globally, who will have reasons we can't anticipate necessarily for why they will want or need eels to be part of that ecosystem, as well as, of course, the other species that are there, many of which are commercially very valuable. So people have reason to conserve them, even if they don't care about eels or deep sea corals or whatever else is down there. So, I'm trying to pile on Canada. I would pile on to the UK, but globally, I think everybody has some. Every nation is a statist system all nations have some duty, but not all have the capacity. And others probably have strong reasons of justice why they should concern themselves with other parts of the, the global ocean.
So, yeah, so I'm going to clear you the second one. Elise and Oliver, Stern has camera, so I take this as an indication that you might, okay, great. Well, Peter.
Okay, so I'll be brief with the second one. I just don't have any sense, unfortunately, of the geopolitics of the high seas, right? So maybe you can give us a sense of who would be the players who are opposed to creating these conservation zones off the, outside the 200-mile limit. Would China be who? I mean, China has this reputation of fishing much everywhere.
Yeah, and they want to do mining. So China is certainly reluctant. So they put in some things, promoting the high seas, the high seas. The US, unsurprisingly, has never signed UNCLOS, but they generally abide by and actually support it. And, because you can never get anything through the US Senate like this. Not if it involves new duties. That's the thing. Oh, new duties. So they won't sign it. But they do abide by it. A lot of other nations do tend to abide by these things. And since they did establish, previously they've got these regional fishing organizations. They've also have regional fishing commissions. Those are the ones that purely advise me. So they can be ignored without any penalty. So the others, there can be some penalties, although they're not super effective. Depends on how commercially valuable the fish is, which is why it's so hard to get serious regulation of tuna, because the market's so huge. In some regions, it would be mining that would be the chief interest. So freedom of the sea seems to allow for that. Hence the reluctance. So early versions, as I said, of early drafts and statements by various countries. Some countries are pressing high seas. Those that would agree to equity don't want it characterized in any way. Part of the reason I was told by, he's an international lawyer, the director of the Sargasso Sea Commission, that probably stewardship language may have survived and passed is that it doesn't in that context have a customary legal meaning. I mean, we all know it means a trustee and a fiduciary, we know they have meanings, but they don't use trustee or fiduciary. They use stewardship, but they did at least characterize it, bringing in the language of intergenerational equity. There was push for that all along, and eventually it was sort of accepted. So yes, any large nation or any nation that has large corporations that are going to have commercial interests are going to want the high seas principle respected. And they can still protest there's an elaborate process outlined in the treaty for getting a marine protected area. One nice thing is, unlike some of the other little authorities that govern this, that, and the other, the approval does not have to come by consensus. You don't have to get everybody to agree. If they want consensus, but if they can't get it, 60% of them is considered good enough. So that's actually a huge step forward too.
Thank
you. Thank you so much. I have a question. So I want to try to link the question of mining with Indigenous peoples, not just in Canada, but more broadly, but that are sort of around the Sargasso Sea area. So I'm looking at, I remember there's been quite a bit of news recently about this high seas treaty sort of discussion. And I'm interested in some of the conversations that emerged from the International Marine Protected Area meeting back in Vancouver in February, right? And so there was a lot of discussion among the Indigenous representatives about deep sea mining, right? And especially the nodules, right? Because there's this sort of estimate that if even the US were to transition its entire sort of fleet to EVs, you would have to do such an incredibly huge amount of mining that you're looking at not just the Sargasso Sea, but like massive quantities of mining to replace the entire fleet of consumer and commercial vehicles. I don't have the numbers, I've heard about this recently. And so one sort of activist here at the meetings is saying, deep seabed mining is like clear cutting the ocean, except that you can actually see what's happening, right? And if you think about the example of trawling, that's sort of one way of thinking about it, but like actually going through and mining and sort of what that does to sort of interrupt or disrupt the ecosystem, which is, we're still sort of learning about what's happening down there. So I'm interested in sort of hearing about, I realize I'm getting a little bit far afield from eels, glass eels and the Sargasso Sea in particular, but I'm just wondering about if you happen to run into any kind of international indigenous solidarity around Sargasso Sea or around eel conservation, or sort of establishing sort of intergenerational equity in terms of access to use conservation, but also in terms of solidarity between indigenous communities across borders, because that's one of the conversations that sort of emerged from this impact conference. I'm just curious, or any piece of that.
Yeah, okay. So different things there. So one, deep sea mining, as you said, that's sort of not a big thing right now.
Okay.
Because if it's genuinely deep sea abyssal plain, that's a long way down, and don't know for sure there's anything worth getting, except this idea of mine. So where there's more interest in mining tends to be where it's not as deep. That means the height of a seamount or something where you might have reason to think there's oil or something else. So really the hot thing for the blue economy is marine genetic resources. Maybe you will find the sea slug, which you can use to develop, a polymer that does something,
right,
or that cures cancer, but or creates buildings that don't fall down during earthquakes, or whatever it is. So that's bioprospecting in that sense is really the big thing. And yes, there are places where indigenous communities who are adjacent, it's outside of that archipelago of nations, EBSA, for example, are obviously really concerned by the idea that they could be shut out of the benefits. Some nations fleet goes in and develops something using, that stuff they got from deep sea toothfish or something, and then they patent it, and the adjacent communities can't even get the DNA sequence. So they have to share the DNA sequences and some other things. There were attempts to see that they share financial rewards. I haven't done very well with that and with the treaty, but they do get some funding for their representatives to participate in negotiations, which so they don't have to bear all the costs of that. So there are some allowances. So yeah, that was a concern. In the case of the Sargasso Sea, colonization wiped out the indigenous populations of most of the islands that are anywhere near. I mean, there's only Bermuda, which is a protectorate. It's very small. The other nations that are nearby that are trying to develop, say, glass gill fisheries, like Jamaica, their indigenous populations were essentially wiped out. There's some small groups that claim to have, some genetic lineage, inheritance, but it's really small. The cultures are all gone. And those folks didn't have a tradition of glass gill. So there isn't one. I gather from folks I've talked to, because I couldn't go today, that various groups believe, because of some vague language about bodies being able to propose marine protected areas, that indigenous groups could do that. But the answer is really no. You have to be recognized as some kind of, you have to have a certain kind of recognitional status for the UN. So that even the Sargasso Sea Commission, because they're not created by an international treaty, doesn't. Then there's the owner's burden of putting together the case and the management plan and everything else, and carrying forward negotiations that have to happen. So they're not going to happen, and nothing's going to happen until the treaties, it goes into force. And second, it isn't going to be those sorts of groups that are going to be able to do it. They're going to need either, though they could create smaller treaty-bound organizations. There are some in some places that have set up things, so that the degree of enforcement they currently have, so we can talk about enforcement, is sort of minimal, but at least they can get something like the shipping authority to put a notice on a map saying, try to stay away from this. Even if it's voluntary, that will still be valuable. But even that involves whole nation states typically, or at least protectorates. So, the Azores and Bermuda have limited status under with the UN. That's good. That you have some other things.
That's great, thank you.
Let's go to Oliver. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Long time no see. Thank you for the wonderful talk, Jennifer. I wish I'd been there. I myself have been away a bit and I had a bit of a knee procedure, so I was a little hesitant to dash around campus. But I'm happy to join. This is the wonders of Zoom. Even though I'm in the neighborhood, it's a little more convenient. One of the things that I sort of consistently bring up or discuss is that sort of translation from the idea of priorities and sort of general agreement to actual action and implementation. It seems like a lot of the specifics, especially when we talk about marine protected areas or some of these nuances, will require the state to act. And so I'm trying to blend a bit of philosophy and sort of pragmatic thinking here to say, I'm opening the question of, does an intergenerational type argument often move governments to do the steps needed versus intra, or versus sort of the more pragmatic kind of sad but true political economy kind of argument? And if so, at the end of your talk, you kind of implored people to kind of reach out and make the case to MPs. And I struggle with that sometimes because I don't know what would actually convince an MP, for example, if we're talking federally, to do this. And I'm just wondering if in your work you've encountered where that kind of sort of philosophical grounding helps the political system, or is it sort of like just part of, it's part of a supporting argument, but it's not really central?
Okay, let's see if I can come back. First part, yes, of course, unfortunately, economic and corporate interests at the global level, global governance, play a huge role in dictating how things happen. And they undermine even those organizations and programs that do genuinely concern themselves with, long-term sustainability into the future for future generations, which is why the tuna protection RFMOs have been so weak and been pretty ineffective, and why the European Union Commission that governs eel harvesting just voted not to decrease catch limits, even though their eels numbers are crashing rather seriously. So there is that. But what getting these kinds of things into these documents means is that it gives those nations that at least do have a genuine interest and concern, have a basis for making a case that they didn't have before. Under, as I said, the previous agreements about, UNCLOS, and then the sort of more important agreement under it that was added in about 94, 95 about migratory and straddling fish that straddle EEZ zones, that it created the regional fishing management organizations. It was that because almost every time it talks about equity, it was so much about, and was so geared towards maximizing output. I mean, it uses the term several times that states in the zones they directly control should maximize sustainable yield of their territories and EEZs. And if they can't do it, they should invite other nations in to take whatever they can't take. So in order to achieve optimal output in all these zones that they control, and that generally regarding the high seas, although marine research and so forth, the same thing, we should be aiming for that. And where the equity concerns are all about, can this landlocked nation get in? Can a new startup fishing fleet from an African country get in? Are they going to be blocked? And it's all about that. And it's good to be worried about that. But now, you know, a nation or groups of nations can say, hey, wait a minute, future generations of our peoples are not going to have this thing because of what you're doing over there. We're not doing it, you know, but other folks are doing it. And it gives them an opportunity. How well these marine protected areas will work once they come to exist is hard to say. It is really valuable that they don't need consensus to create them. But as you'll probably sure know about marine protected areas that exist in Canadian waters, that doesn't preclude any use of them, and nor should it. But you can have further concerns about how the decisions are going to get made about what are consistent with long-term sustainable use. But it is, you know, it's a step forward to have something to appeal to in these things. And so, you know, that's why what I want people to write to their MP about is just encourage Canada to sign this damn thing. I mean, I don't think Canada won't, but sooner the better, you know, to get up to that number of 60 nations that is needed before it becomes effective.
Yeah, I certainly share your view on the importance of such declarations. I mean, we see lots of examples where it can show up in, you know, surprising ways in Supreme Court judgments, or, you know, it helps, like you say, it almost helps the sort of the choir, those who already believe. So there's this wonderful saying that I had from an old international law prof, which was, international law is like a lamppost is to a drunk, not for illumination, but to help prop them up when needed. And so there's that sort of tension, which I agree with, but I just maybe just to probe one step further, you talk about helping make, you know, this, for example, the small nations help making an argument, but to whom are they making the argument? Because mostly they have to make it to their own constituency, for lack of a better word, to enact the kinds of interventions that they have under their own authority. Now, you know, in Canada, we can have a good conversation about Indigenous authority and Crown authority and stuff, but every nation. So what I'm less clear on is how it helps them make, to whom would they make the argument in a compelling way?
Well, they will make the argument to a new authority, which will have its own new secretariat that's created under this treaty, which will have a scientific commission, which will be the first recipient of the proposal. So they have to make a scientific case for that. Then there has to be the consultation with any nations adjacent to the marine protected area, because the country proposing it need not be adjacent to it in any way. They don't have to have any kind of physical tie to it. So adjacent nations need to be discussed. And then this authority takes a vote of some kind. And if it gets created, it then gets reviewed by the same authority. I think, is it going to be 5 or 15-year intervals? I can't recall, as to whether the protected area should go on being protected or for substantial reasons have arisen. So there's that's being created. And it is, to the extent that anything is for the UN, going to be a legally binding instrument. And that means that even non-signatories can be sort of punished in various ways if they were to violate the terms of the agreements made about that. So yes, then we have to go back to the case of the individual countries and how that will happen. Often it will take tapping into economic interests of those countries, pointing out that we need fish that live there, we need the coral reefs, we need the whatever it is. I think, you know, another case of what's been suggested many times. It is actually often quite valuable for species protection to put a price on a species, because we're more apt to protect species we care about. Sometimes we care about them because they look good, like polar bears or other things, but oftentimes it's because we value them economically in some respect. So, you know, there's that, but pretty much every fishery around the world is considered now either overfished or to capacity. So increasing, there are a lot of nations who will have economic interests in protecting regions conveniently outside their own waters, which will help support their own fleets, I would think, and their industries.
Thank you.
I'm afraid the good looks eels don't have going.
Hearts said. Yeah, actually, it's perfect. Thanks so much for the presentation and my questions and follow up what you just said about a particular price tag of things. I like putting price tags on things in general. The thing is, I'm a little bit confused because your argument is Canada should join this treaty in order to increase its tax and package of abuse of justice. And this is a bit of a question which follows from what Ida mentioned, is I struggle to see, or I'm confused about to whom do we owe this duty, or to whom Canada owes this duty. Because you could say, well, the duty is owed to future generations, right? So future generations have an interest in having eels around, for instance. They have an interest or have a right to have, eels in the sea, just as much as we do have, and we can deploy eels in the sea, right? This duty can be owed to indigenous people, right, who have a right to kind of like still have wild eels because this is part of their way of life and so on, right? Or we can just say, well, this is a duty owed to the eels themselves, right? So animals can also have rights. This is a special issue, and so on, right? And it seems to me that in certain type of cases, these type of duties can be contradictory, right? You have to choose. You can't fulfill them all, right? So if you say, for instance, well, we have a duty towards future generations. Future generations should have a right or the privilege of enjoying eels, assuming, of course, that future generations can have rights and we have duties to them, and this is a special issue as well. This says that basically, well, actually, I should just say, commodifying eels is the best way to go because basically, if eels are expensive, we have an incentive, to preserve them and to have them around, not in a wild state, of course, but in kind of this sort of like, husbanding fisheries and so on. And so, in 200 years, there's still be eels, right? Because it's been sharing for this incentive, for the profit motive that the eels are going to be around. But this contradicts with the duties we may owe to, for instance, indigenous people who harm these type of fisheries. And so, yeah, I'm a bit confused, like, to whom do we owe these type of duties? And how do we solve, and how this treaty maybe does the job of solving contradiction between them?
Yeah. Okay. So in the case of protecting the Sargasso Sea, I'd say Canada's obligations are overdetermined, which means there are multiple bases for saying there's an obligation. In some way, you can easily lose one, and still rely on others. As for, in this case, the nature of the market for the eels is not encouraging their preservation, it's just the reverse.
Oh.
So the current circumstances are not that eels are doing well, eels populations are crashing because they're being fished as adults and they're being fished as these tiny little juveniles. They live their lives there. They're the opposite of like salmon. They're catadromas. They spend the bulk of their lives in rivers and lakes. They only go to the Sargasso Sea to spawn and then they die. And never come back. So they end their lives there. And then these little larvae come back and then they grow up essentially in rivers and try to make their way up to lakes and stuff. So we want them there. Having a price can be valuable if the market's well regulated, but right now there are no means of doing so very well, coupled with the lack of protection for their environments. So they are up to use, the overused term perfect storm, but it kind of applies to eels in many regions. And it's been replicated, around the world. The Japanese eel population has crashed here. Several others. I think the Australian ones are doing a little better. I don't know where they go. They're somewhere in the various places in the Pacific. There's no one place in the Pacific where they all go.
So you want to say,
but anyway, yeah.
The eels population is crashing in wild eels populations, right?
Sorry, which?
The wild eels population is crashing, right? But you can't just like tell this.
There are several populations of freshwater eels around the world, and most of them are overfished or
like domesticated.
No, because it's like in the lake, you can't breed them. Nobody knows how to do that.
Sorry, all right.
The aquaculture starts with juveniles. So you start with the glass eels. That's why the glass eels are the most expensive fish per pound right now.
I see.
You take them and you put them in a tank. We have an aquaculture facility in Dalhousie University that's working on trying to do this. Because then you have indigenous aquaculture. And then instead of you selling glass eels, you can sell the full-grown ones, although you get less money per pound. There'd be more pounds of them. So it would still work out, I think. So these are the challenges. They're not being well managed. Many of the challenges should be better managed by Canada under existing sort of understandings of what the government is supposed to be doing on our behalf, such as improving water quality. They could install eel ladders, do something about these dams and so forth, so they're not able to get to or from lakes where they work on. We can do things like that, but there is still the fact that they all the eels that spend their lives in the Atlantic go to this one area and rely, their juveniles rely for some period of time on that environment. You want a lot to survive and to come back given all the fishing pressures. And a lot of stuff is eating them. So this is why you really want a large population. Okay, so for Canada, globally on behalf of future generations of everybody, including future generations, but also present generations of everyone, including communities, whose livelihoods may depend, or whose cultures do, on eels being around. So it has duties to both. Yes, duties where the practical courses of action they lead to can conflict, which is why we need to balance them. Which is why we need to balance high seas freedoms versus heritage. So yes, we're also going to have to balance present, future generations' interests in these and other things.
And this treaty is a good way of doing this? Or?
Yes, and I would not bring in rights language, because you can have duties without having relative rights.
Right, yeah.
So it just instrument duties and leave it there. And there are duties that Canada, for example, has already accepted to, through various laws and government structures to Indigenous, non-Indigenous Canadians. So the same is true as the US. The UK at least has global ones. There maybe you could bring in respiratory justice, that would be outside talking about past history of colonialism. So it ought to be second doing various things. But it's a different kind of argument to leave to other people. I just took me so long to understand what was going on with this new treaty. I'm not going any further right now.
Yes. We probably have to wrap up soon. Back to what Oliver said, because Oliver, in the end, you said, how is the policy process influenced by these arguments? We make this clear too, but I'm just wondering, do you have a sense, the High Sea Treaty, what arguments swayed many governments to support it? In the end, is it, a more philosophical argument about, a fundamental responsibility that we have towards the environment and future generations? Is it a kind of a legalistic issue that we say we need to be part of it? I'm just wondering on the ground, right? And that's what Oliver brought up. How does it actually play out for those who make the decisions to sign these treaties and to support them or not to? Do you have a sense empirically how over the those years, right, in the making, what arguments actually were driving the agenda?
I think it's sort of been an evolutionary, sort of social evolutionary process about thinking about the relationship of human beings to their environment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also certainly helped that, UNDRIP and UN support and other agency support of Indigenous rights has gotten more Indigenous views sort of getting some sort of a hearing. In fact, I didn't mention it, but one of the nice things about this treaty is that frequently, whenever it mentions and scientific research must be done, there is always immediately a clause that says, and to consult with Indigenous traditional knowledge that is relevant or adjacent local communities where there may not be an Indigenous, non-Indigenous, but there's local knowledge. So that's encouraging. By part of it was just economic, the increasing evidence of fisheries collapse under the old UNCLOS regime, which was never very fully adopted, which led to in the 90s, these further treaties under UNCLOS about the straddling fish and migratory fish. So it was really obvious that they had not been thinking long term and that people had to start doing that. And you begin to get that language then appearing in other documents. So the Convention on Biodiversity couldn't override the UNCLOS language because it comes later. But on the other hand, once it's there, then you can begin to build in that language elsewhere. Its language was a common concern of mankind that hasn't actually been very popular, but stuff about the value of biodiversity and you get that definition of sustainability that was in the Rio framework 92 gets repeated over and over, and people sort of get comfortable with that idea. And as more and more ecosystems look like they're losing productivity, there's more and more economic as well as philosophical and other reasons to say, yeah, we should be thinking much longer term about it. So I think it's a mix. You've got much more vocal and somewhat more powerful environmental lobbies in more countries. You've got more concern at a sort of general consumer level. They don't want to think that their tuna is full of bits of dead dolphin or has killed dolphins. You've got that to pick up on, but you've also got really serious economic interest that, wait a minute, tuna is getting really hard to get the right kind of tuna for sushi, especially if it's going to be bluefin, which I didn't mention, but may also spend some time in Sargasso Sea. Some of them do, not all. I mean, the costs of getting a whole bluefin tuna is also ginormous. So you've got to be worrying if your livelihood and your industry depends on their availability. You know, so it's a slow evolutionary process, and it is slower than many of us would like, including Oliver. And we'll have lots of hiccups, but it's at least moving in a more positive direction, let us say.
Yeah, I think that was also the mood, when this treaty came, was decided upon that. There was some sense of optimism. But Jennifer, thank you for bringing this important issue to us and looking at it from the lens of an environmental philosopher. I'm sure that's a label you like, but it's you definitely got us thinking, and surely there's also political work to be done on following up on this. So thank you very much.